Hello, good evening. Welcome to the How To Academy. And I should perhaps tonight, we should at least pretend that what we're going to be doing is talking about the history of football, which to some extent we are. We're talking about the history of football, but very much from the perspective of the necessity of entropy to lead to conscious creatures that eventually want to kick a ball around a field. We're going to be talking with tonight, as you know, it's Brian Greene who wrote this book, which is, you can probably see how ragged my edition is. It is because I reread it many times. It is a fantastic book until the end of time, and that is the main subject we're going to be talking about. And we will, who knows, we will be covering a lot of different ideas about entropy, but also consciousness and the need for ceremony and ritual. I'm going to see how much ground we can cover. But hello, Brian.
Hi there, Robin. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm going to get straight in here. And I would also mention, by the way, to everyone, if you have questions, just pop them in the Q&A. We will try and deal with as many questions tonight as possible. And I thought the starting point perhaps is where we should start, is also what you say in the book. Is you started off, you were kind of studying psychology, and then it was the romance of mathematics that got you. And I think that sometimes when people hear that, the romance of mathematics, how can that work? Tell me how that did capture you.
Yeah, well, you're right. I was studying psychology, not as a major, but just sort of as a side course of interest as I was an undergraduate. And one of the assignments was to try to write your own theory about human motivation, why people do what they do. And I had various ideas, but it always felt as I was writing this paper that I'm just making this stuff up. I'm not really grounding it in any deep principle. And then I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who taught me mathematics over the course of many years when I was little, allowed me to get more advanced than I otherwise would at school. And when he described math as the sole undertaking of the human species that touches things that are eternal, timeless, like once you prove a theorem, it's like always true. It's never not true. And this drive to touch something timeless in reflection of our own recognition that we're mortal beings that are not timeless, that juxtaposition between recognizing that we're mortal beings, but that we can touch things that are immortal, that to me all of a sudden was an encapsulation of a drive, a motivation, why we do what we do. We try to deny our own mortality and touch things that are timeless.
And it's in that part of the book, you talk about the desire to glimpse something that was transcendent. And I think this is very interesting, because I think what this book does is shows so much how some people's kind of casual view of science, which is counting things, adding them all up, and then coming to a result. And that words like transcendence are meant to be very much in what might consider to be the traditional spiritual areas. So that idea of glimpsing the transcendent, can you give me a sense of when you have had those moments?
Well, I've had them in a number of different ways, and it touches on the word romance that you used just a moment ago. When you stare at a mathematical result that's described in the world, take Einstein's equations to be concrete. When I first learned Einstein's equations, what is a collection of little symbols? What is it? Just to lay it out there, r mu nu minus a half g mu nu r equals 8 pi g over c to the fourth t mu nu, right? Now, what does that mean, right? It talks about the curvature of space-time being related to the amount of matter and energy in space-time. And when I first learned that formula, yeah, it had a deep pull, a deep, almost romantic pull, because in a short collection of symbols, you are understanding a deep truth of reality that was true near the Big Bang, that's true today in the vicinity of black holes or the vicinity of the Earth or anywhere else in the cosmos, and as far as we can tell, will always be true, or at least a close approximation to the truth, assuming that further developments extend these ideas in the way the history of science teaches us is quite ordinary, quite normal. And so that's a kind of transcendence. You're going beyond the everyday experience of us creatures crawling around on planet Earth, trying to survive and trying to make meaning and trying to engage in social relationships. You're going beyond that to touch something that transcends human existence. It's just, in some sense, part of reality. And that had a deep pull on me as a younger scientist and as a kid. And perhaps we'll touch upon it in this conversation. As I've gone on in my career, my own view of what math is and what science is has gained more nuance. But certainly as a young researcher, that romantic pull of seeing deep, immutable truths through the language of mathematics was deeply magnetic, deeply romantic.
See, I was interested in this book where I think of all of your books, this is the one that is the one most concerned with the human condition and humanity dealing with these. And I wondered if in some ways you almost do see that return to having had an interest in psychology. Suddenly that has returned. What is it about when we see sometimes these symbols, when we hear these words, when we start to understand that disorder itself is required for beauty, all of those things that can seem very contradictory? It seems that you've now also returned to some of your initial kind of concerns.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I don't want to speak as though, you know, my life is reaching its end. But yeah, I mean, you know, I've definitely, you know, as you get older, you do, at least I find myself returning to themes that may have shifted toward a mental back burner over the years. I mean, when I was a young kid, 13, 14, 15, I was driven into math and physics, not solely because I found the ideas fascinating. Absolutely, I did. But what also drove me was the belief that insight into the nature of reality could shed some light on the deep questions that we all have, like, why am I here? What's the point? You know, how are we supposed to make sense of our lives on planet Earth? And of course, as I got deeper and deeper into things like relativity and quantum mechanics and string theory and pushing the frontiers of understanding there, the connection to the human side of the story was not front and center. It was trying to do the math and trying to push the envelope of understanding further forward. And certainly as I've gotten older, those initial motivations for being excited about these ideas have certainly found their way back into my thinking of the world. And this book indeed is an encapsulation in some sense of a multi-decade journey from that young kid asking the kinds of questions that we all do as adolescents, trying to make sense of our lives, seeing the answers to those questions, or at least the closest that I feel we can get to those answers, through the lens of physics and mathematics. And in that way, having a very humanist slant on subjects that for many are mechanistic and dry, and the kinds of things that, you know, you learn the formula, you solve the problem, then you leave it in the classroom. And my point is the deep understanding of math and physics can shed some powerful light on who we are and how we make sense of our existence.
Do you think there is I mean, I think I've noticed it. There's a more noticeable movement in science communication to make up for, there was a period of time where I think a lot of people, when they first find out ideas of why our universe is as it is, they can find it alienating from the culture that they're in. And I seem to notice more and more writing now, which is talking about the fact that so many of these ideas from the birth of the universe onwards actually connect us to everything, that rather than alienate us from all the objects around us, they are the thing that brings us back to them.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think scientists, and I can speak more personally about myself, have become ever more comfortable with putting an emotional side to what we do, a human side to what we do. I think there was an era when scientists were trained and told, don't infect the literature of science with anything that's subjective. Science is all about finding the objective truths. So, you know, a good example of this is, you know, when we write papers now in the scientific journals, for the most part, over the last few decades, they're very clinical, these papers, right? They talk about the idea and what we developed to try to test the hypothesis, you know, the scientific method, as some people describe it. But you go back to the 1920s, the early papers on quantum mechanics, there's one in particular where the two scientists, Davison and Germer, described a mistake, a catastrophe in their experimental setup. They turned a dial too high and this evacuated chamber exploded. And in the debris from the explosion, as it turns out, they were able to find evidence for quantum mechanics. It wasn't by design, it was by accident. And they told the world of that accident. If you were to write that paper today, most scientists would suppress the accident and talk about the brilliant insight that led to this result. And so over time, I think there's a kind of ebb and flow in how much humanity we're willing to inject into our work. And I think that the pendulum is swinging back. And I think scientists are willing to put the human side of the story. And that story is exactly as you describe it. It's not alienating to think of how we fit into the grand cosmological unfolding, to know about the Big Bang, and to know about how that produced particles, and how those particles came together into stars and planets, and how those molecules on at least one planet coalesced to yield living systems, conscious living systems. To see ourselves in that cosmological unfolding is deeply satisfying and profoundly affecting in how we think of ourselves. When you can see how you emerge in the same way that a rock or a tree or a planet or a star did, you feel a connection to reality that's hard to achieve in any other way. And I think that is a profound lesson that many people, I think, are finally absorbing.
Now, I'm kind of going to leap ahead in some ways, but you just reminded me of a story about Dirac, where I think a while ago it was probably about a year ago, we did a show all about the end of the universe, how it might end. And it was one of those great things where physicists, you were all laughing your heads off as you talked about different ways that everything that in any way could experience, any curiosity, consciousness was gone into whatever was left. But I could see why the laughter was there, because it was like, but we have the ideas, we have some new equations. I think it was the joy not of the end of the universe, but of the joy of understanding, I hope.
Yes.
But there was also, I don't know if you talked about the Dirac thing, which is, here was someone, a great scientist, who accepted, he did not believe there was an afterlife. He did not believe he would get a second go. He believed when he died, that was the end of it. But also, whenever people talked about the idea of the end of the universe, he could not deal with that. That was his existential anxiety. He didn't mind the idea that all humanity would be destroyed, all that, but the idea that the ideas would no longer exist was for him too painful. I mean, do you see, I've just wondered in terms of your balance between, personal death and the death of all endeavor. That is a tough one.
Well, I think for me, and perhaps it parallels Dirac. I don't know his story particularly well. Of course, I know his work intimately. But for me personally, when I came to the full recognition that it all ultimately goes away, and this has been sort of a journey of understanding that I've been on for a long time, but I recall when I first really took in that idea, that it's not just that the stars disintegrate and the planets and life disintegrates, that consciousness in the cosmos will come to an end. These are things we can pretty much establish through the laws of physics and mathematical analysis. But when you really recognize that it all disintegrates, that even the things that we thought to be eternal, going back to your first question, even mathematical theorems, do they exist if there's no mind to cogitate on them? I mean, does Pythagoras' theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, what existence can it possibly have if it's not oscillating around inside some conscious being's head? In some abstract sense, it can be out there, but what does that really mean if there is nothing out there to recognize the import of that theorem, what it means and what it tells us about the world? And for me, coming to that point was a dark moment for me personally. And I, as I describe in the book, it did send me into a dark place for a period of time. But, the resilience of the human spirit, at least in my particular case, took me to a different way of thinking about things. It's a way that is not original. I mean, mindfulness teachers, philosophers, sages throughout the ages have long since taught us that look into the future to ground your sense of meaning and purpose is probably not the right place to look. The place to look is kind of in the here and the now, the moment, the exquisite moment that we have. And I got to that same place, but through a cosmological trajectory, not just sort of thinking about the human condition, which is how many of the great thinkers of the past got to that conclusion. For me, it was deeply understanding the laws of physics and mathematics, what it tells us about the future, recognizing, as Dirac apparently did, that it all does go away. And that brought me in a very potent way to a realization that look into the future for the answer is not a fruitful approach. It's thinking about the here and the now and recognizing the beauty and nobility of the fleeting moment that we have on the cosmological timeline.
I'm trying to remember. Is it Emily Dickinson you quote? I'm trying. There's
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, many poets, many philosophers, great songwriters, Shakespeare. I mean, in many different ways, the arts have been inspired by this recognition of our mortal nature. And my point is that when you place human mortality in a cosmological story that tells us that the universe itself is in a sense mortal, that the things that we are deeply familiar with in the universe, they all go away. And even the thoughts that we have in understanding the universe, the ideas in some sense disintegrate because there are no cogitating creatures left to think about those thoughts. I think that it inspires not just the arts, not just the artists and poets, but it can inspire all of us to a deeper recognition of how incredibly special this moment is. For most of the past, there was no life or consciousness. And for most of the future, on toward eternity, there won't be any life or consciousness either. There's a small window, small on cosmological scales, but a small window, until maybe 10 to the 50 years from now, when we beings in principle can exist. And outside that window, no life, no thought, no consciousness. And to me, that is a profoundly affecting insight into the nature of reality.
I remember when I was touring with Brian Cox, 2019, there was one line at the end of the show where we were talking about the nature of time. And then he would end the show by saying that you had to remember that the laws that mandated there must be life in the universe were the laws that mandated that there must be death as well. And I particularly remember when we did the USA part of the tour, nowhere else in the world was there such a frisson there at that point. A sense of shock, but not necessarily horror. There was something, yeah. There was some solace, nevertheless, in that finite nature.
Yes, yeah. And many philosophers have asked themselves the question, what if we weren't mortal? What if we really were immortal? I mean, that's what we have dreamed of, since the earliest of our brethren recognized that we all die. But what if we didn't die? And if you start to think about that, as many of these philosophers have, it's not a rosy story. It's difficult to imagine how we find any sense of purpose in a universe where we will always be here. It's hard to imagine where you get a sense of achievement and accomplishment if you've got infinite amount of time to get it done, to hone your skills, to become ever better at whatever you undertake. So the finite nature of life, however painful it is, however terrifying it may be, to think that everything you care about, every life that you have touched, every experience that you have had, all of it goes away. Yeah, there's a degree of terror associated with that. But without it, if we truly were immortal, I don't know, a deep sense of ennui and boredom might be the fate that we would suffer in that circumstance.
Yeah, there'd be no books to read because no one would really get around to writing them.
What's the point? Yeah, we can. I'll write it. A million years from now when I've got nothing better to do, or so. So it's
Now let's get on to Entropy, because a lot of the book is, and this is always, I think, the first time people come across this idea, the idea that all of the beauty that we see, all of the wonder, is an increasing amount of disorder, can seem quite shocking initially, because we look at all of the objects around us, both natural and architectural, and you kind of go, no, this can't be anything to do with increasing disorder. We're now getting shapes and all of these things.
Yeah. No, there's a powerful law, many people have heard of it, called the second law of thermodynamics. The only law actually that Einstein said was always going to be with us, wouldn't be superseded by some kind of deeper insight. And that law does speak to disorder, or in the technical language, entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder in a physical system. And the second law assures us that there is an overwhelming tendency of disorder to increase, of entropy to increase over time. And you're right, when you hear that, you're like, well, come on, how could that really be? As you point out, there seems to be a lot of order in the world around us, all those books behind me, the structure of architecture that you mentioned as well. And the way this order can come to be and still be consistent with the drive toward disorder is that the second law only speaks of the overall amount of disorder, say in the entire universe. That must increase, but that doesn't prevent little pockets of order now and then forming, so long as in their formation they generate or emit enough disorder to the wider environment to compensate for the order that they might create. And the prototypical example is a star. When a star forms, you got all these particles floating through space. Very disordered, right? Then gravity starts to pull the particles together into a more orderly shape. Ultimately, with such density and temperature that the star begins to have nuclear processes in its core and it lights up. Now, how did that orderly star form? Well, in the process of those particles all coming together, a great amount of heat and light is emitted, streams outward to the wider world, carrying away disorder. So the star's formation generates disorder in the wider world, and on balance, the disorder does indeed go up, even though an orderly structure called a star forms. And that template, which I like to call the entropic two-step, where, order can go up here so long as enough disorder increases in the surrounding world, that is the template. So any order that you see from us human beings to books to architecture to anything else, if you deeply understand how that orderly system came to be, you will recognize that as it formed, it was emitting disorder to the wider world. And so disorder does go up, even though you can have momentary pockets of order. So all we human beings are momentary pockets of order as the universe is towing the line of the second law, heading toward a universe in which disorder is on the rise.
And so